Round 2 of the Accentus Biel Grandmaster Tournament 2018, and we're going to take a look at the game Maxime Vachier-Lagrave, the top French player, against the current world champion Magnus Carlsen. So in round 1, Magnus won his first game, Biel drew his game, and now they are playing against each other. And what's curious about the situation is that Biel is a former second of Magnus. He has supported him in the World Championship match 2016 against Carlsen. So this makes it a little bit more interesting. Biel starts out with 1e4 and Carlsen goes for the Pirc variation here. Knight c3, g6. Unusual choice by him, but he has played this before. And Biel himself now decides to go for a rear line. He goes bishop f4. There are many ways for white to play this line. There's the 3-pawn attack, there's bishop e3, which is a typical move. But bishop f4 is also very interesting. And I've looked at this myself as well. And after c6, Biel had not prepared this line before the game. He goes knight f3. Just a side note, I think that queen d2 is a more ambitious approach because white still stays flexible with the knight. He can also sometimes play f3 to support the pawn like this and go g4 later on. And I think that after queen d2, white has a little bit better chances. After knight f3, however, it seems that black is already more or less okay. Now, Biel goes queen d2, castle. Now h3, stopping any bishop g4, knight g4, queen a5. And this position has been seen before, not a lot of times, but usually white goes bishop d3. a3 is another move the computer suggests. But Biel goes for e5, and that just does not promise him much. So now both players are on their own, but Carlsen finds the right continuation here, plays knight d5. The point is that after knight takes d5, black can exchange the queens and now takes back in d5. We reach an endgame where black really doesn't have to worry about anything. He will go e6, and then we actually have kind of a French structure where this is a little bit unusual, bishop on g7, where it's a little bit misplaced because it's biting on the pawn on e5. But on the other hand, this is also, as we'll see, a little bit unpleasant for white. And well, let's just first make some more moves to give you a better idea of what's going on here. And then I'll say something about the general plans of this position. So h4, h6, Biel was hinting at h5 to get some counterplay over the h-file. So Carlsen plays prophylactically h6. So after h5, he could just go g5 and keep the position closed on the king side. So bishop d3 was played, bishop d7. And now I would like to say some words about this position. It is around equal, but certainly it is more pleasant to play with black. And why is that? Well, black has this half open c-file where he can initiate some play. Whereas for white, in this position, it's very difficult to see where he's going to play. Because as we saw already on the king side, not much is happening. Black can always keep the position closed. And his other break in this position would be to play c4. But here you can see this is clearly not possible to implement. So what Biel tries to do here is exchange some pieces. He wants to go knight d4. The problem is if he goes knight d4, the e5 pawns hang. So he actually takes a lot of steps here, rook d2, rook e2, to finally prepare knight d4 and exchange some pieces. Whereas for black, as we'll see, it's very easy. He can advance his queenside pawns and pressure white on the king side. So in general, these structures, I would say, if black goes into an endgame, he's usually fine. With queens on the board, it's easier for us to imagine some kind of attack happening against the black king, but without queens, there's no attack happening anytime soon. So let's see how this goes about. White doubles on the e-file to now finally play knight d4. And I might throw in one little point here, maybe at this point or maybe one move later, but probably at this point, white could think about playing h5. The difference is that in the same line we're about to see in the game, if we compare it, now we get to the game, same position, just this is the difference. Then what happens here is white exchanges a pair of knights, brings the bishop to d4, and now we'll see shortly the point I'm trying to make here. Bishop b5, good move by black, exchanging this bishop, also exchanging the defender of the pawn on c2. And here, this is the point I was trying to make. Now black goes h5, and he can bring the bishop into the game like this. He also fixes another pawn on the dark square, just like the bishop, which is going to be left on d4. So if we imagine in our minds for a moment that white had this inserted here, this would be advantageous for him. So just a little subtle detail, but it could make a difference later on. Let's see again. King d2, h5. Now bishop h6 is an unpleasant move, so white goes f4 to stop that. Bishop f8. Now the bishop comes into the game via f8. And here MVL, true to his nature, seeks counterplay. MVL is a very dynamic player and he knows where to find play if he needs to. g4 is a good move. Takes, rook g1. And now Carlsen also offers the second bishop for a trade, which is fine. He somehow needs to get his rooks into the game. And even though all the bishops come off the board here, this endgame is still tricky for white because white has the worst pawn structure now, and these pawns are weak. If the f4 pawn falls, then also the e5 pawn might follow soon after. So the structure favors black, and he can still use the c file for his advantage. Rook c4 is a strong move here, pinning the f4 pawn. And now MVL went h5. Getting rid of this one weakness on h4. King to e7, that makes sense. The king is very safe here. And this was a critical moment. Up to this point, yes, the position for white was uncomfortable, but defendable still. And here, a very precise move was needed to keep the position level, which MVL did not find. He played rook gh4, and also in the press conference he said he thought this was the only way to play. There's another way to play here. Rook h6 is proposed by computer. The point is to put the rook on f6, which makes a lot of sense because you defend the pawn f4 and also attack the pawn f7. So for example, now rook bc8, rook f6, and black wouldn't have time to take on c2 because of the rook g7. He would have problems with this pawn. He couldn't even defend with rook f8 because the rook would be hanging on c2. Excuse me. So here probably black should play rook 8 to c7, rook g7, now king f8, defending the pawn. Rook back to g2, white also defends the pawn. Rook e4, and white would be in time here to play f5, sacrifice a pawn, but not allow black to keep his pawn structure intact, and the white rooks would be active enough here for him to keep the position equal. Still in all these lines, of course, it's white who's defending, that's clear. Now let's see how this developed. Rook gh4, rook g8. Now also rook bc8 was also a good move, but rook g8 also is very attractive to make use of this open g file. And here MVL played f5, which is a mistake, after which his position becomes already very critical, not to say lost. Rook h8 was necessary, but these moves, of course, they're all pretty difficult to find. Check, check. Yes, black can take on c2, but black is also facing some counterplay here with rook b8, and the point is white wants to go after this king. So for example, now after rook takes b2, there's rook h8 already threatening mate, and already the king cannot escape a perpetual check here. So after rook b8, black still has an advantage, but it won't be easy, and white has good drawing chances. After f5, however, the position becomes already lost. Check, check, with check. Black is putting his rook into position to get the pawn on c2. Rook c takes c2, and this is really not a situation you want to be in. Usually one rook on the second or on the seventh rank is bad enough, but two rooks, and then also the king being cut off on the first rank, which means black has mating ideas with his two rooks. We just have to imagine one rook somehow getting to the first rank. It's already checkmate. Really bad position to be in. But MVL is fighting on. f6 check, king d7, and rook takes b4, taking a pawn and also defending this pawn. And black really shouldn't take on b2 now, because this would take pressure away, and also after rook h7 he has difficulties defending this pawn. White would be back in the game. Of course, Carlsen saw it coming and he played a5, attacking the rook and also forcing the decision. The rook was well placed here, stopping d4, also defending the pawn. So now the rook has to move, goes to b8, And now rook cf2, this is what I was talking about, threatening checkmate. So king e1 is forced. And now Carlsen brings the king. King activity is huge in the endgame, very important factor. So this makes a lot of sense. Check, king b5, rook h7 going after the pawn. And now d4, pushing the passed pawn forward, rook g8. Trying to exchange one pair of rooks that would really help white here in this position. But black is not cooperating. Check, check, king g1, and now rook f4 to defend the pawn on d4 and also be able to take an e5 next move. Rook takes f7, rook takes e5, rook c7. And up to this point, really Carlsen has played this game magnificently. He has put pressure from the opening early on and then got into his endgame, slowly increased his advantage, and now he could finish the game pretty much by playing d3. He took the pawn f6, but d3 was pretty much a winner right away. The point is that white cannot get behind the pawn easily. If he goes rook d7, there's rook d5. And you still have to stop this pawn somehow. And let's say rook takes d5, pawn takes d5. Now there's the threat of this pawn queening. And if you play rook g2, then I can also, well, support the pawn with my king. King c4, this king is cut off, completely lost. So probably white should go rook g2 right away. But after rook takes f6, he would be also in dear trouble, being a pawn down and facing these connected passed pawns. So this is over. Carlsen took on f6 right away, but the problem here is that his king gets in a worse position now. King has to go all the way back to a7, and as we said already, king activity is very important. So white still has drawing chances here, even though position remains lost. Rook g6, rook e1 check, king g2. And here Carlsen goes wrong. He plays d3, a tempting move to push the pawn forward and threaten d2, d1. But also the pawn becomes disconnected from his friend here on the e-file. So one way to play would be e5 right away, and also you could give some checks first, but sooner or later really you should play e5 here, also making use of the fact of rook g1, rook h7 ideas. But after king h3, now e5. Position is still very tricky. These double rook and games are just immensely complicated and difficult, but it seems that black should be winning here. d3, let's get back to the game. Rook d6, stopping the pawn for now. Of course, you couldn't take on e6 because after d2 you cannot stop d1 queen coming and you would have to give up a rook. So rook d6, rook e2 check, king h3. Now after rook e3 check, white could bring the rook in between. This is why white moved the rook to h3. So Carlsen goes d2, rook g8, and rook g8 is a good move because white wants to get a second rook behind the pawn and tries to win the pawn. Also notice this rook cannot really help because black has to worry about his king as well. So rook has to defend the 7th rank. Here Carlsen plays king b7, rook gd8, and now black gives up this pawn. And this of course has been an improvement for white because now black doesn't have these connected passed pawns anymore. He's still pawn up, but the material has been reduced. And in general, if you're the defender in an endgame where you're worse, you want to exchange pawns. Not pieces, but pawns. This is the rule of thumb. For the attacker, it's the way around. You want to exchange pieces. If we imagine here all the rooks coming off the board, immediately black would be winning the pawn game. Here MVL goes rook e1, rook f6, rook d6. The computer says king g3 would be also a way to go here, but I like rook d6. It's attacking the pawn and also cutting the king off this way. Rook takes a2, and here MVL plays king g3, but it seems he would have needed to play rook b1 check, king c7, rook a6, and as my friend, our friend, the computer tells us, this is a draw, in fact, because the white rooks are so active and black's defending the pawns passively with his rooks. So this would be a draw, but of course still a lot of play ahead and not easy to defend. Also, like I said, in this position, king g3 is given as a draw by the computer. In either case, tough position to defend, so no one can really blame MVL for going wrong here. but he had a chance to actually completely come back and save this game. After rook b2, now the rook is shielding the king from checks, and for now black's up 2 pawns, and the problem for white is he can never take on e6 because this endgame would always be hopeless with this king so far away, and black could just push this pawn forward and win. So MVL tries rook e5. Still the position remains difficult to play. Like I said, these double rook endgames are just immensely difficult to play. Both rooks behind the pawn. Black's defending the pawn for now. Now MVL gives a lot of checks, drives the king to e7, rook e5, and here rook fc3. Carlsen recognized that he can give up this pawn because this one will decide the game. Still not easy to see for the human eye, for sure. Here MVL goes king f2. If he defends against the threat of rook c2, rook b1 with rook e2, then black will bring over the king slowly. And let's just see how this plays out here. King to b7, rook a4, rook c6. Now this is giving some ideas like rook a6 in certain situations. For example, here, if white goes king f2, black can give a check here, check, check, exchange the rook. This is usually the winning motive for black, to exchange the rook and then win this endgame. And now we see rook a6 is an idea, and if white exchanges, then the king is just one square too short. Black queens and wins. Also in this position, if white doesn't go king f2, this is still a side variation, this is not the game. If white goes rook e7 check, king b6 and brings the rook once again back, now black is in time to play king b5 and then to play rook b2, and once again this idea of rook a6 will decide the game. Here white has to lose a tempo defending the rook, and also if he takes, the rook perfectly shields the king from checks, rook b8, rook b6, and it's over. So MVL went king f2, but now also rook b2 check, rook e2. And here black could also bring the king closer, but Carlsen found a direct way to finish it. He played rook h3, threatening rook h2 check, king g2, but now the rooks come off and the king is far away on h3. Still, you have to make sure that your king will make it there first. So let's see how this plays out. a2, king g3, king c7, king f3, and now important move, king b7, winning a tempo. Since white cannot take on e2, here black would queen next move. The rook has to move back, and now rook h2. And after king e3, king b6, king d3, king b5, once again black is winning a tempo by attacking the rook. And these two tempos that black just won by attacking the rook decide the game. Rook a8 and now king b4. White is just made it. If white was able to play one more move, king c3, that would be a draw. But king b4, the king will get to the pawn, will support the pawn, and it's over. This is why MVL resigned right here. Let's just see how this plays out. Let's say white gives some checks. The king comes all the way to c1. And now king b1 supporting the pawn, check, and now the rook comes in between. Black promotes next move and wins. So after king b4, MVL resigned and Carlsen starts the tournament with 2 out of 2, and what a great win for him with the black pieces here. Choosing an offbeat, slightly offbeat for a top level, opening the Pirc, and then getting into his equal endgame, which is a little bit more pleasant to play, and slowly squeezing out the win in this complicated rook endgame, which was just full of interesting variations and so tough to navigate. But for the most of it, Carlsen handled it very well and deservedly took the full point here. Hope you guys enjoyed the analysis. If you have any questions, let me know. Otherwise, feel free to subscribe for future videos like this one, and then I'll catch you again very soon. Bye bye.